Would you like to come and debate your existence with this highly bigoted person? Oh, you don't? That's so confusing to me. Hey Spuds, it's Jamie. Welcome back to another video. First one to channel, I don't know, but welcome either way. And today we are talking about Heartstopper, that lovely feel-good show full of the LGBTQ plus representation that we love to see. And if you've not heard of Heartstopper, then where have you been? Also, if you've not watched the most recent season of Heartstopper, which is season 3, it came out about a week ago now, why have you not watched it yet? No, I'm mostly bringing this up because I just want to let you know there may be some spoilers in this video. Nothing too major, but just a little pre-warning that there are some spoilers in here. Now, I'm personally a big fan of Heartstopper. It's absolutely the kind of show that I wish existed when I was a teenager. It would have helped a lot. It would have made me feel less alone. I probably would have figured things out a lot quicker. I'm only slightly jealous that it came in about 15 years too late for me, but I'm mostly super happy that something like this exists now. It's definitely quite young in style, which makes sense for the primary audience it's aimed at. A little bit cringe in moments, but it's fine. It's forgivable. But what I would say is season 3 saw the content like age up, which makes sense because since season 1 the characters are now older as well. And one thing we see a deeper exploration of is the current transphobic rhetoric that we're seeing, particularly in the UK. And that is what we're going to be talking about in today's video. This video is going to center around a conversation and a specific scene that happened to Elle, a trans woman character in the show portrayed by Yasmin Finney. I have not rewatched the first 2 seasons very recently, but if memory serves me right, and from reading things online, the show in the first 2 seasons didn't really dive very deep at all into the potential transphobia or transphobia that Elle had or was facing. I remember some mentions of bullying in season 1, but I don't think there was really much more going on than that. And although I love the feel-good nature of the show and the fact that it was offering this really kind of happy, positive representation, I do think in certain moments throughout the first 2 seasons it maybe shied away a little too strongly from the more difficult times. It's really not the worst thing at all, and season 3 has changed that. In its entirety, the show definitely leans a bit more into heavier, more difficult topics, and transphobia was definitely one of them, with one moment in particular. And it was a moment I personally found really hard to watch, both as a trans person and as a trans person who's pretty much literally been in the same situation that Elle was in this particular scene. And the specific scene I'm going to talk about happened in episode 6 of season 3, and it revolves around Elle taking part in a local radio interview. I feel like anyone watching who knows how trans people, particularly trans people in the UK right now, are treated in mainstream media, probably already sensing where this is going to go. For a tiny bit of context and a little spoiler here, Elle is now attending a art college. She has moved on from school. She is older now. She is at college, and she's very talented, and because she's very talented, she's been posting her art online and has grown an online following. Because of this online following, her art teacher during an art class is like, hey Elle, a local radio station wants to interview you, and it's very much posed as they want to talk to you about your art and about your growth on social media through your art, and that is it. And it all sounds very friendly, very trustworthy because a teacher has come and told her about it. Cool, she's excited. We see Elle go to the radio station with her parents and Tao, and they're all very excited. Ella's a bit nervous, so it's very much built as this like celebratory moment with Elle's art. But honestly, I was watching it going, oh god, what's about to happen, please. In one sense, I was like, I don't want to see this young trans character have a really horrible experience. But on the other hand, I was like, maybe it would be good to show that. Everything seemed fine at first. The people at the radio station were lovely. They were reassuring Elle, saying she's going to do a great job. And even the interview itself started off very innocently and went in the direction that Elle would have been expecting it to go in. She's introduced as a local art student who has grown on social media through posting about her art. It's all very in line with what was expected. And then Elle gets the opportunity to speak about her art, speak about why she started sharing it on social media, and how her following has now grown to over 50,000 followers. Good going. Elle was then asked by the interviewer about the subsequent attention and whether it's felt overwhelming and all of this stuff. It all seems very normal and fine and going along the right trajectory. But then, and I think this is the bit the show does really well, we see the interview gradually get worse and worse, and one step at a time get more uncomfortable, which is quite accurate for what happens a lot of the time. It can start off very like pleasant, like little introduction, and then it's just like question after question and comment after comment that gradually gets worse and worse until it suddenly dawns anew, oh my god, I'm being interviewed by a transphobe. That is the vibe. The first step honestly isn't super bad at all, and if the whole thing were trans positive, I'd even say that it made sense to ask this. The interview pivots from Elle's art solely to then bringing in the fact that she's trans to the conversation, but that's because Elle's art focuses a lot on the fact that she's trans, and so the interviewer asks her about this focus. We do see a slight shift in comfort comfort level from Elle at this point, and I don't know if it's apprehension for what might be coming next or a discomfort about talking openly about being trans. Could also just be the show trying to build up a bit of tension to help guide the viewer as to where this is about to go. But I would say that as a standalone and as a question, if coming from an ally, asking about how Elle's transness plays a role in her art, totally fine. I feel like because her art does incorporate the fact that she's a trans woman, when being asked about her art, it's inevitable that her transness will come up in some way. And she answers calmly. She says she's proud to be trans and it's a big part of her life, and that's why it comes into her art. And this was a really interesting bit for me, I guess, as somebody who's quite far along in transition, and also as somebody who's seen the conversation really growing into a point of like, let's get more representation out there to show that being trans isn't all who we are. We are so much more than our transness. And a lot of trans people saying how small a part and how kind of almost irrelevant in many situations being trans is in our lives. But this isn't a negative, because everybody is different. There's nothing wrong with being trans being a bigger part of a trans person's life. And for Elle being quite young and in the earlier days of her transition, it makes perfect sense that it would still be a big part. It would also make sense if it carried on being a big part. There's no right or wrong answer with this. It was just something I noticed as interesting and slightly different to other conversations we've seen around trans representation recently. So it is a big part of her life, so it makes sense that it comes up in her art. And because it comes up in her art when she's being interviewed about her art, it makes sense that it comes up, right? The interviewer replies kind of oddly, in my opinion, with "that's quite important right now, isn't it?" Throwing it back to Elle, it feels a little bizarre. She's not given her opinion on it. She's not opened up a conversation. She's just kind of pushed the trans stuff back to Elle immediately. And already we see the art element of the discussion disappearing. But still, at this point, I feel like the interview could go either way. It's feeling a little odd, but a lot of this, in my opinion, is because of the way the scene is shot. Cutting back and forward between Elle and the interviewer, and the zoom on Elle and the increasing like discomfort and her facial expressions. I feel like it's less that what's being said is super out of hand at the moment, and more just that the show is building up viewers to know where it's going, if that makes sense, to show that this is already not going perfectly, which I see because we're already veering away from the topic. So the show does a really good job at depicting these subtle shifts in comfort levels from Elle and from the people watching the interview as well, and it's building this tension with the interview, almost confirming where things are heading before they head there. Then the interviewer says, well, trans identities are a hot topic right now. Okay, and to me that is the clincher. That is the moment. It's still subtle, but I think it's a really crucial moment where a lot of trans people interviewed would be like, that's an interesting thing to say, and I don't think this is going to go great. Because the people that have made being trans a hot topic are transphobes. They are the people that have over-politicized being trans and made it some big conversation and big scary thing. Trans people haven't done that. Being trans isn't and shouldn't be a hot topic. We just want to live our lives and have equal rights, please and thank you. So as soon as somebody brings that up and it's not in reference to, and it shouldn't be, and trans people are not getting treated great right now, you kind of get the vibe that there is a problem. And then from that point, we see the step progressively get bigger and faster as it kind of dissolves into this negative experience. Katie, the interviewer, says that some would call the topic of trans identities a culture war. I was just sat there like, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I know what rabbit hole Katie has fallen down. I'm sorry for all the wonderful Katies out there. You are not represented by her. It does get worse though, I'm very sorry to say, because then she mentions feminists versus trans activists. And that is honestly, to me, the last nail in the coffin of this potentially being a positive interview for Elle.
He's already dead.
You just know that when someone is calling a transphobe a feminist and referring to trans people only as trans activists and posing feminism as something that is in opposition to trans people, that really does mean trouble. You know that this is not going in the right direction. It doesn't always mean that the person asking that question or saying those things is super transphobic themselves, but it definitely means that they have gone down a few rabbit holes and they have probably not been speaking to or listening to the trans community when forming these opinions and these questions. And they've just heard from the feminists that have certain opinions around trans people. I'm doing feminists in bunny quotes because they are just transphobes who are pretending to be feminists. They hide behind their feminism so they don't need to feel so bad about being bigots. Although saying that as a trans person, this is where it became really obvious that this was not great, I still think it's potentially quite subtle for people watching who are not aware, who aren't trans, who aren't aware of the insidious nature of a lot of trans rhetoric. And that's why I'm so pleased that Heartstopper explored this, because having that visual representation representation and that building tension and really showing like these are the moments that are causing discomfort to a trans person. These are the cues that a trans person is picking up on that this isn't a positive interview. I think it's really helpful to have that representation. And I'm really hoping it will help some people notice the more subtle instances of transphobia that a lot of trans people face and the awful way that trans people are treated by the media. Because although I will and I am praising Heartstopper for this scene, it was mild compared to a lot of the interviews that happen for trans people. So at this point, it's clear interviewer is not coming from a trans positive place. To her, Elle is there to speak on behalf of a whole community, to defend trans people's existence and justify herself as a trans woman. Katie isn't interested in Elle's art. She's not interested in Elle's social media following. She's not interested in Elle for the reasons why Elle was told the interview was happening. She's interested to hear if Elle has anything to say about the political side and the anti-trans rhetoric that is being brought up about trans people. Obviously and understandably, Elle is now looking very clearly uncomfortable. I think Yasmin Finney does a really great job with her facial expressions in this moment to really show the gradual increase in discomfort that Elle would have clearly been feeling in this situation, as any trans person would have been feeling in this situation. It felt awkward and it felt emotional, and I felt so bad for this trans teenager thinking she was just there to talk about her art, and then things went down this very uncomfortable and bizarre and disrespectful route. Then comes the bit that made me really mad. If you thought I was mad already, wait until you hear about this bit, because the interviewer then reveals that she had a feminist on the show the week before. Oh no. And the feminist spoke about the importance of same-sex spaces. Oh no. Clearly not actually a feminist, just a transphobe. It's like with the feminists versus trans activists. You know when it's like same-sex spaces come up as a conversation point, you know it's not going to be good. And I mean, honestly, how crappy is it that trans people get treated like this? Imagine this scenario. So this show is like, oh, we had a transphobe on last week. Let's call them a feminist. We kind of already decided we liked what they have to say, but being trans is a hot topic. How about we dupe a teenage trans woman to come on the show thinking she's going to talk about her art, and then actually we ask her all about anti-trans rhetoric and politics? I mean, what the actual hell? Elle's family, Tao, and the radio employee watching from outside are looking very uncomfortable. And this bit confused me slightly because I kind of assumed that the radio employee would have been aware of what was going on. Did they not know who was on the show last week? Katie, the interviewer, then used the dog whistle to make herself look very calm and rational and understanding, that she thinks it's important that we hear all sides and opinions. And then she calls it a debate, as in the conversation around trans people, a debate. I simultaneously love and hate the fact that Heartstopper brought this in, the word debate. I love it because it's so important to spread the awareness of the use of this word and the inappropriate use of this word, and the fact that trans people are not up for debate. Trans lives, trans existence should never ever be something that is framed as a debate. Human rights are not a debate. I hate it because it's hard to watch. So clearly I was getting progressively angrier watching this scene, and when I heard the word debate, it was like the coffin of this being potentially positive for Elle was then put in the ground, covered in dirt, and the interviewer was just jumping up and down on it. No way in hell was this interview set up with positive intentions. At best, it was set up with curious intentions from the interviewer. I found it so hard to watch, and I felt so bad for Elle because this is a situation that so many trans people get tricked into being in. But seriously, this is so damn common for trans people to experience this kind of stuff. A majority of the mainstream media that covers trans topics rarely does so in a purely positive light. Very rarely will you see a trans person, in the UK at least, appear in a positive way to just speak about a topic or their transition or something. It's so often that transphobes get the spotlight and get the microphone a majority of the time. And if a trans person is present, they are there to be the other side of the debate and literally have to sit there and listen to somebody be horrifically transphobic and then be expected to stay calm and act as if this is just a normal thing. It does not make any sense to me. Transphobes do not deserve to have a platform when speaking about trans topics. Why are we listening to transphobes? Why are we listening to cis people, biased cis people who have gone down conspiracy rabbit holes when it comes to the trans community? Why are we not listening to trans people? I get very mad. I know this is a fictional show, but as I said, it's because this stuff happens in real life. And also knowing it's a fictional show, where was the safeguarding for this character. Why was nobody looking out for her? I appreciate they went into it very naive. It's fine. I'm not mad at like the family. Where was the check from this teacher who got the request for the interview on the show, on the presenter, on the previous guests? Why was nobody looking into that? This is an interview that should never have happened. And it really highlights the caution that trans people need to take when being part of anything like this. Otherwise, we can really find ourselves in situations that are incredibly difficult and upsetting. And as a trans person, really hard to stay calm in these situations. For the people calling it a debate, for the transphobes, this is a philosophical query, a conversation, a debate, the latest thing that they can complain about and hate upon. It's easy for them to stay calm. But for trans people, this is our lives, our identities, our rights, our healthcare. It is so personal for trans people. And it's not personal for transphobes. Even though some of them want you to believe it is personal, it is not. Elle stays very calm, calmer than I have stayed in this video, and says that trans people aren't a debate. We're human beings. Yes, thank you, Elle, we absolutely are. Good response. But the interview is not done. Oh no, Katie still has more to say. She refers to the feminist that she had on the show last week, saying that this feminist believed that gender-neutral bathrooms would lead to an increase in assaults against women, as in against cis women. Awful. Honestly, so atrocious. And this is the moment where I would criticize the show somewhat. Personally, I think the conversation around trans people and trans people using bathrooms and the spaces correct for their gender is such a big topic. It's such a horrible topic that is even something that is brought up. I personally think this moment in the show could have been so much more powerful if this bit had been rephrased slightly. Yes, it's true, transphobes do not like the idea of gender neutral bathrooms. However, this is a secondary point to their main point, which is they want to exclude trans women from public women's spaces, including bathrooms. And I wish the show had gone for this angle instead, rather than about gender neutral spaces, because I think this would have been a much stronger point to make, and it is the main point to highlight. Because these transphobes are trying to claim that trans women using women's bathrooms is a danger to cis women, when there is literally research that shows it's not. Trans women have been using women's spaces for decades, and the whole gender neutral bathroom conversation is kind of a distractor point. The main thing to highlight here that I really wish they'd highlighted is trans women in women's spaces, and the fact that transphobes don't want that to happen. I still appreciate what they did. It's just my personal opinion that reframing it in this way would have made it a better educational moment. Elle calls a turd, as she should. She doesn't actually say a turd is a turd. She calls the feminist a transphobe, because the feminist is a transphobe. The interviewer says nothing more than calling it a bit of a heavy topic and saying, shall we move on? Yeah, shall we move on? Like, no shit, Katie. You manipulate a teenage trans woman to come on your show. Bring up transphobic rhetoric as if it's an acceptable thing. Call a transphobe a feminist and ask Elle to comment on it. She was there to talk about art. I know, I'm getting so mad over a fictional scenario. But it genuinely happens. This stuff actually happens. And like I said, I think the show portrayed quite a gentle version of what can actually happen to trans people in these situations. Although I do get why they didn't go super heavy with it, or any heavier than they did. And I think overall it was a good balance. The interview is not quite over yet. I know. I'm exhausted just recounting what happened in the show and giving my opinion. With one final spurt of bullshit, Katie moves on from discussing trans people in bathrooms and brings up the fact it's been proposed that teachers may be forced to out trans children to parents and tell parents if their kids are using different pronouns in schools. And she asks Elle's opinion on this as somebody who transitioned young. This is very, very far from art, Katie. At this point, Elle stops the interview, as she should, and the interviewer is all like, oh, I'm sorry if I offended you. Firstly, of course you did. No ifs, no buts, no coconuts. You offended. Secondly, that's not a real apology, Katie. You're not sorry, are you? We see Elle's mum calling out the manipulation that was used to get Elle on the show, and then we see the subsequent emotional impact that the interview has on Elle throughout the rest of the episode, and I think it does spill into other episodes as well. But honestly, it was such an uncomfortable scene to watch that I think was so well done. In many ways, I do have minor criticisms. I think it could have been more powerful, but because it's something we've not really seen before, I'm so happy that it was represented. I hate that it happens, but I'm really pleased that this was put out there as a form of education. I think the lead up to the specific questions asked by the interview that were clear that this was not a positive interview were really well done. The feminism versus trans activists, the hot topic, debate, etc. all good. Again, my only qualm is the phrasing of the bathroom question. I think it could have been a lot more powerful without ruining the subtlety of the educational point. In planning for this video, I found a little thread on Reddit where some people shared their thoughts on this scene, and I thought it would maybe be fun to read some of them out. I don't know if fun is the right word, but I wanted to read some of them out so we could hear other people's opinions as well. Elle's story was so sad. The fact that she was there to discuss her art and the interviewer took that advantage to ask her about some debate with trans people, that is incredibly wrong to do. Not only that, she was completely blindsided, but also because she's a teenager. She was in such a naive position. First radio interview, newly having a social media following, being told it was to talk about her passion, being told by a teacher, having her parents come along, being so young, it all created this really horrible recipe for her to fall into this trap. Exactly, a literal kid. She's 16 years old and you're asking her for her stance on complicated political policies, not to mention exposing her existence to a bunch of highly toxic trolls who might not have found this child otherwise. I was so angry on her behalf. That is such a good point. The level of irresponsibility here, a show that had a feminist transphobe on the week before, clearly likely going to have listeners who are of the same opinion. You're bringing in a teenage trans person and then you're asking them these political questions. You are opening them up to these horrible people. Not okay. Yeah, that was up, but I'm glad they included it. Being trans is really hard sometimes, and the hardest part for me has been the way I'm constantly mistreated for who I am, or these allies who aren't allies at all and see transphobia as a hot talking point and not actual bigotry that kills trans people. Really made me think about the interviews with trans people I've watched before and the real reason they were there. Also, seeing articles about Yasmin Finney online about how she's a groundbreaking trans actor makes me think it's true, but she's also just a great actor. Love how the show itself questioned the narrative we have of trans people in the media. I honestly do really love that. I think it's so powerful, and I think it's something that, aside from trans people calling it out and saying like, hey, media is really horrible to trans people, it's not something I've seen spoken about. And to see it depicted in a show that has such a large following and is so popular and will reach so many people, I think that's really important, and I super appreciate that platform being used to educate on this point. I think it was a really good representation of how most trans people just want to live their lives, yet people try to make their very existence a political issue. As soon as the interviewer started talking about the feminists she brought on for the debate, I started yelling at the screen for Elle to run like I was watching a horror movie. It was uncomfortable. It was genuinely like, oh my God, you need to leave. But I really do think showing these uncomfortable moments and uncomfortable things will help trans allies to spot insidious transphobia, will highlight the rubbish that trans people face and the disrespectful treatment that trans people get when it comes to mainstream media and other bits, but this specific conversation is in the media, and will help trans people realize that if they are ever in this situation, they don't deserve this and do not need to put up with this kind of treatment. As someone who has literally had this type of thing happen to me, please do your research on who wants to interview you, the show or platform it's going to be on, previous guests they've had on, and how those interviews have gone and what's been said. And don't be afraid to make it clear what you are there to talk about, that you will not talk about any deviations from this, and highlight specific topics that you will absolutely not discuss. And you should never ever feel demanding or difficult for doing this. You're literally just requesting, oh hey, you've invited me for an interview to talk about gaming, let's just stick to the gaming. Yeah, please do not bring up any political trans topics or transphobia, because that's not what I'm there to do. Trans people deserve to be treated with respect when taking part in media requests, and deserve to respond to media requests fully informed about what that request is for. So honestly, if they're not going to respect you, don't do it. You don't need to be there. And if they cancel the interview when you make it clear what you are comfortable to talk about, then you know they had bad intentions and you're better off not doing it anyway. I personally had an L-type interview moment many years ago. This was when I was still pretty new to being online. I had a much smaller following. I hadn't done media stuff before. I'd never done live stuff before, and this was a live radio interview on like a county level radio. I had no idea what to do or what questions to ask or what to expect. I was invited onto this radio show to speak about my online platform and my transition. I believe it was around the time I was doing my picture a day. It was all posed very positively, and I was excited to do it. I was like, that's so cool. I'm gonna go be on radio. Yeah, I get to sit in that little room with a microphone. Woo. So Sharp and I drove to this radio station, and it kind of went similarly to L's, to be honest. I don't remember the specifics because it was such a long time ago, but it started off introductory, it seemed okay, and then gradually the language that the interviewer was using was just like, that's uncomfortable, and I kept having to correct him, and it was disrespectful. I don't think he was transphobic. I think he was extremely ignorant, and he'd had some transphobic talking points and language and ways of referring to trans people and incorporated those in the interview. The talking points were obviously different back then, but it had this similar tone and level of discomfort. Again, I don't think the interviewer was coming at it from a transphobic perspective. They just clearly hadn't even taken 2 minutes to do a quick Google search on respectful language and types of questions that they should be asking. And I was pretty young at the time, and I felt like I was having to just be there and stand up for myself and correct him rather than actually speaking about what I was there to speak about. So when watching that scene, I could really relate to how Elle was feeling and that level of discomfort and being blindsided in an interview and just, yeah, feeling like you've been tricked to be there. Yeah, like you're going to go and speak positively with someone who's open-minded or at least willing to listen, and that's not been the case. It's something that happens to trans people all the time, and it's not always in a way where they've been tricked to be there or not told what's going on. Sometimes it's really obvious that the interviewer does not have the best of intentions and is trying to pose something as a debate, and I think it just shows the absolute lack of awareness from a lot of people that they don't realize that this is not okay to do, and they're just like, oh, hello there, would you like to come and debate your existence with this highly bigoted person? Oh, you don't? That's so confusing to me. Like, a vast majority of the invites I get to take part in media stuff nowadays is to be like the trans person on like the trans side of the debate, having to sit there and defend my right to exist and my right to live as myself to a bigot. And trans people are expected to sit there and stay calm whilst a bigot is just openly discriminating against them. I say no to these because they are emotionally exhausting and they literally do nothing. It's unfair that they happen. They shouldn't be happening. Sharbra and I have done a couple in the past together, but it literally made no difference, and it was just so frustrating. It was like talking to a brick slug, and then it just led to a spike of hate comments we received after things aired. So although this scene in Heartstopper was difficult to watch and it brought back some uncomfortable memories, I'm really glad that Heartstopper covered transphobia in this way because I've never seen it done like this before, and I think it's such an important topic to discuss. It showed that transphobia goes beyond comments online. It goes beyond bullying on the playground for kids, which is all horrific as well, but it showed the subtlety that transphobia can take sometimes and the manipulation involved. And I'm sure that that scene is going to help some people identify the manipulative language used sometimes when things are being said with bad intentions towards the trans community. Overall, I think the season of Heartstopper was more grown up than the previous 2 seasons, and I do think it was a little on the nose sometimes with some of the like teaching moments, which I think could have been a bit more subtle and baked more naturally into conversation, but it's still doing a great job of being wonderful, positive representation for LGBT plus young people and older people as well, whilst not completely shying away from the harder topics of being a teenager in general and then also being LGBT plus. But yeah, I just wanted to pop in and have a chat with you about that specific scene with Elle because it was something I could relate to. It's something I've not seen depicted in that way before, and I think it's so important. So let me know what you thought of this scene specifically, let me know what you think of the video, and let me know if you've watched the new season and what you think overall. I would love to hear all of your opinions and comments, so go leave them down below and think about giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing if you want to, but no pressure. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye.